Picture this. It is 2 in the morning. You are awake for reasons that are either your fault or the internet's fault, the line between those two things having blurred considerably around midnight. The house is quiet, the world outside is quiet, and somewhere on your ceiling or your wall or that specific corner of the bathroom that you've decided not to think too hard about, there is a fly. It is not moving. It has not moved in a while, actually. It's just sitting there, perfectly still. And you, in the specific deranged mental state that only 2 in the morning wakefulness produces, find yourself staring at it and wondering something that you have never once wondered before in your entire life. Is that fly asleep? The question sounds ridiculous. You know it sounds ridiculous, but now you can't unask it because the fly hasn't moved. It's sitting there with its legs slightly tucked and its wings folded and its entire tiny body doing something that, if you saw it in a mammal, you would describe without hesitation as resting. And now the question is in your head, and it has friends. Do insects sleep? Do they dream? Do they have something like the crushing exhaustion you're experiencing right now? Do they lie awake, metaphorically, thinking about the things they should have done differently? Okay, probably not that last one. But the first question, the sleep question, that one turns out to be one of the most fascinating and genuinely unresolved areas in all of biology. And the answer, which is yes, with enormous asterisks, qualifications, and a philosophical sidebar about what sleep even is, reveals things about the nature of consciousness, the biology of rest, and the evolutionary origins of one of the most universal animal behaviors that will make you look at that ceiling fly completely differently. To answer whether insects sleep, you first have to answer a question that seems like it should have an obvious answer but actually doesn't. What is sleep? For most of human history, sleep was simply the thing that happened when you closed your eyes and weren't conscious for a while. The advent of electroencephalography, the measurement of brain electrical activity through scalp electrodes, changed everything about how scientists understood sleep because it revealed that sleeping brains are not simply quiet brains. They are doing specific, organized, cyclically structured things that are distinct from wakefulness and distinct from anesthesia or coma. The characteristic brainwave patterns of human sleep stages, the slow waves of deep sleep, the rapid oscillations of REM, the distinct patterns of lighter stages in between, became the primary definition of sleep in neuroscience for most of the 20th century. The problem with using brainwave patterns as the definition of sleep is that it's a mammal-centric definition. Insects don't have the brain structures that produce those patterns. They don't have a cortex. They don't have the hippocampal neocortical dialogue that underlies slow-wave sleep consolidation. They don't have the pontine circuits whose activation produces REM. If the definition of sleep requires mammalian neural signatures, then insects by definition cannot sleep, which is a conclusion that would strike most entomologists as premature. Contemporary sleep science has therefore moved toward a behavioral definition, a set of criteria that can be applied across species without requiring neural architecture. The behavioral criteria for sleep are a period of reduced motor activity, a posture or location associated with the rest period, elevated arousal threshold, meaning it takes more stimulus to wake the animal than during wakefulness, rapid reversibility from the rest state in response to sufficient stimulation, and homeostatic regulation, meaning the animal accumulates sleep pressure when sleep deprived, and compensates with increased sleep when given the opportunity. With those criteria in hand, the question of whether insects sleep becomes empirically testable, and what decades of research have revealed is that insects meet these criteria in ways that are sometimes surprisingly precise. The fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, is the insect whose sleep has been studied most extensively, partly because it's the insect most extensively studied for everything, and partly because its short lifespan and genetic tractability make it extraordinarily useful for the kind of experimental manipulations that sleep research requires. Fruit flies have a daily rest period with all the behavioral hallmarks of sleep. They adopt a characteristic resting posture, abdomen lowered, head drooped slightly, wings folded close to the body. That is distinct from active wakefulness. During this rest period, they are significantly less responsive to stimulation than during active periods. A puff of air that would send a waking fly bouncing off the walls barely registers during rest. Their rest is consolidated into a single major period aligned with the dark phase of the light cycle, with a briefer secondary rest period in the early afternoon that has been described entirely seriously in the scientific literature as a fruit fly equivalent of a siesta. When flies are sleep deprived, through mechanical disturbance, through genetic manipulation of sleep-regulating neurons, or through the use of drugs that promote wakefulness, they subsequently sleep more than undisturbed control flies. They compensate for the deficit. This homeostatic rebound is one of the most characteristic features of sleep across all animals studied, and its presence in flies demonstrates that the rest period serves some regulatory function that the animal's biology tracks and adjusts for. Genetic dissection of fly sleep has identified neurons and neurotransmitter systems that regulate the transition between rest and activity. The mushroom bodies, paired brain structures in the fly that are critical for learning and memory, play a central role in sleep regulation, in ways that parallel the role of memory-consolidating brain structures in mammalian sleep. Serotonin, dopamine, and octopamine, the insect equivalent of norepinephrine, all modulate fly sleep in ways broadly analogous to their roles in mammalian sleep regulation. The molecular machinery of sleep shows deep evolutionary conservation that the behavioral similarities reflect. The question of whether insect rest involves anything like the neural dynamics of mammalian sleep, the organized oscillations, the memory consolidation processes, the synaptic homeostasis, is where the science gets genuinely complicated and where the most interesting current research sits. In mammals, one of the primary proposed functions of sleep is synaptic homeostasis, the downscaling of synaptic connections that were strengthened during waking learning and experience. During wakefulness, the constant stimulation of neural circuits by experience drives synaptic potentiation, the strengthening of connections between neurons. If this process continued without correction, the brain would eventually saturate, losing the ability to encode new information. Sleep, in this model, allows a global downscaling of synaptic strength that resets the system for the next day's learning. In flies, evidence for something analogous has accumulated. Sleep deprivation in flies impairs learning and memory performance in ways that recovery sleep rescues. The molecular markers of synaptic strength in fly neurons change across the sleep-wake cycle in directions consistent with the synaptic homeostasis model. And genetic manipulations that impair sleep in flies produce corresponding impairments in memory consolidation and cognitive performance on the behavioral tests available for insects. This suggests that whatever the fly is doing during rest, it's not merely conserving energy in a passive, unregulated way. The nervous system is doing something and functionally important during the rest period, something that wakefulness cannot substitute for, something that the animal's biology compensates for when deprived of it, something that leaves cognitive traces in its absence. Whether to call this sleep in the full sense that the word carries for human experience is a definitional question. Whether it's a functionally similar state serving functionally similar purposes is something the evidence increasingly supports. Move away from Drosophila and the sleep story across the insect class becomes more varied and more revealing about the diversity of solutions that evolution has found for the rest problem. Honeybees have one of the most extensively studied sleep patterns among social insects, and their situation is more complicated than fruit flies because they exist in the context of a superorganism, a colony with collective behavioral requirements that constrain individual rest patterns in specific ways. Forager bees, the older workers that leave the hive to collect pollen and nectar, show consolidated rest periods that occur predominantly at night, consistent with their diurnal foraging activity pattern. Their rest involves the same characteristic posture features, reduced muscle tone, antennae drooping, reduced responsiveness, that qualify as sleep by behavioral criteria. Sleep deprivation in forager bees impairs their famous waggle dance performance, the directional communication system through which foragers convey the location of food sources to their hive mates. This is a striking finding because the waggle dance requires precise integration of distance estimation, direction relative to the sun, and time elapsed since the original flight, a cognitively demanding performance that degrades measurably with sleep loss. The communication system that makes bee superorganism function possible depends in part on individual forager bees getting adequate rest. Nurse bees, younger workers that remain inside the hive tending larvae and maintaining colony infrastructure, show a different rest pattern. Because the needs of the brood don't follow a neat diurnal schedule, nurse bees rest in shorter, more distributed episodes throughout the day and night rather than consolidating rest into a single nighttime period. Their sleep architecture is fragmented in a way that is functionally analogous to the sleep of new parents with infants, which is either a comforting or deeply depressing parallel depending on how you're thinking about it. Cockroaches. Not the most popular subjects for research, but among the most scientifically useful given their hardiness and experimental tractability, demonstrate sleep patterns that reveal something important about the deep evolutionary origins of behavioral rest. Cockroaches are nocturnal, and their rest period occurs during daylight hours. The timing is regulated by their circadian clock, the molecular timekeeping system that aligns behavior with the light-dark cycle. Cockroach circadian clocks use the same core molecular components: the clock cycle transcription factor complex, the period, and timeless feedback genes that mammalian circadian clocks use. The molecular clockwork is evolutionarily ancient and highly conserved across the animal kingdom, and it drives the timing of rest activity cycles in insects as surely as it drives the timing of sleep-wake cycles in mammals. During their daytime rest period, cockroaches show the characteristic features: specific sheltered posture, reduced antenna movement, elevated arousal threshold. They are harder to disturb than during their active nighttime period, and if disturbed and kept active during their rest phase, they subsequently show compensatory rest when allowed to recover. The homeostatic pressure for rest accumulates with deprivation in cockroaches just as in flies and bees, demonstrating that the regulatory system for rest is not a fruit fly specific oddity, but a conserved feature of insect biology broadly. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Praying mantises add another dimension to the insect sleep story that researchers didn't expect. Something that looks, in some ways, remarkably like REM sleep. REM sleep in mammals is characterized by rapid eye movement, which gave it its name, alongside muscle atonia, activation of the limbic system, and the vivid dreaming that most people associate with sleep as an experience. For a long time, REM sleep was considered a mammalian characteristic, possibly associated with the specific neural architecture of the mammalian forebrain. Then, cephalopods, octopuses, and cuttlefish were observed to show periodic color changes and pattern displays during rest that some researchers interpreted as evidence of something functionally analogous to REM, including possibly something like dreaming. In praying mantises, researchers studying rest behavior have observed periodic episodes during rest that include subtle limb movements and behavioral changes that resemble the motor expressions seen in REM sleep in mammals. Whether this represents a genuine homologue of mammalian REM, an evolutionarily ancient form of a state that has been independently refined in different animal lineages, or a superficial behavioral similarity with different underlying mechanisms, is something the research hasn't definitively resolved. But the convergence is striking enough that it raises questions about whether the oscillating structure of sleep, the alternation between deep, quiet rest and more active rest phases, is a more universal feature of sleep than the mammal-centric view of sleep science assumed. The question of whether insects experience anything during their rest period, whether there is any subjective dimension to insect sleep analogous to the dreaming experience in humans, is where the science reaches its limits, and philosophy begins to take over. Consciousness in insects is one of the most contested questions in philosophy of mind and comparative cognition. The dominant view for most of the 20th century was that insect behavior, however complex, was essentially automatic, driven by hardwired stimulus response programs without any inner experience mediating the behavior. Insects were understood as sophisticated reflexes, not minded beings. That consensus has been increasingly challenged. Research on pain processing in insects, nociception, and, controversially, the possibility of something like subjective pain experience, has documented that insects don't simply respond reflexively to damaging stimuli, but show behavioral responses consistent with ongoing aversive experience, motivational trade-offs in the presence of noxious stimuli, and pharmacological responses to analgesic compounds. Bees demonstrate what some researchers describe as pessimistic cognitive bias following negative experiences, a shift in how they evaluate ambiguous stimuli that is analogous to the cognitive state associated with negative affect in mammals. Whether any of this implies subjective experience in any philosophically meaningful sense is genuinely unresolved and may be unresolvable with with current methodological tools. We lack the ability to directly access the inner experience of any other being, and the inference that subjective experience is present relies on structural and behavioral similarities to our own experience. Similarities that become harder to evaluate as the animal in question diverges more from human neural architecture. What the research suggests is that insect nervous systems are not the simple automatons the classical view assumed. They integrate information, maintain internal states, show something like emotions or moods in a functional sense, and regulate behaviors in response to those states in ways that parallel aspects of minded behavior in more obviously conscious animals. Whether all of this adds up to experience in the way that human sleep is experienced, with the narrative richness of dreaming, the sense of having rested, the particular quality of consciousness at the transition between sleep and waking, remains an open question. The ecological diversity of insect sleep patterns is worth examining because it illustrates how the basic sleep regulatory system has been modified across the enormous range of ecological niches that insects occupy. Monarch butterflies face a specific rest challenge during their extraordinary multi-generational migration across North America. They need to navigate accurately across thousands of kilometers using a sun compass that requires precise time compensation, and that time compensation depends on a functioning circadian clock that must be maintained through the disruptions of migration. Monarchs rest at night during migration, roosting in large aggregations in trees that provide thermal benefits and possibly predator dilution benefits. Their rest periods are behaviorally consistent with sleep, and the circadian integrity maintained through these rest periods is directly linked to their navigational accuracy. Aquatic insects, mayfly larvae, aquatic beetles, water striders present sleep challenges of a different kind. Rest in an aquatic environment requires either finding a stable substrate to rest on or maintaining some level of postural control to avoid drifting, and the arousal threshold during aquatic rest must balance predator detection needs against the restorative benefits of reduced responsiveness. Mayfly larvae show rest periods at specific times of day, oriented against substrate surfaces with reduced gill movement and reduced responsiveness, the aquatic equivalent of the behavioral sleep criteria that land insects display. Parasitoid wasps, insects that lay eggs inside other insects, their larvae consuming the host from within, face a particularly interesting sleep ecology because they must find, assess, and paralyze specific host species that are themselves trying to avoid being found. The cognitive demands of host-finding behavior in parasitoid wasps are substantial, and research has shown that parasitoid wasps are sleep-deprived during active host-searching periods and compensate with extended rest afterward, consistent with the sleep cognition trade-off that makes rest non-negotiable across insect biology. The evolutionary question, why sleep evolved, and what the ancient origins of insect sleep tell us about sleep as a biological phenomenon, is one of the most actively debated questions in sleep science. Two broad categories of sleep function hypotheses compete for explanatory priority: restorative hypotheses, which argue that sleep serves tissue repair, metabolic clearance, and neural maintenance functions that wakefulness prevents, and adaptive inactivity hypotheses, which argue that sleep functions primarily to keep animals safely inactive during periods when activity would be risky or energetically unproductive. For insects, the adaptive inactivity dimension is clearly relevant. Nocturnal rest in diurnal species reduces predation risk during periods when the animal's visual systems are poorly suited for activity, and energy conservation during thermal extremes has obvious adaptive value for small ectothermic animals. But the homeostatic regulation of sleep, the fact that sleep pressure accumulates with deprivation and is compensated with recovery sleep, demonstrates that adaptive inactivity alone is insufficient as an explanation. If sleep were simply advantageous inactivity, any period of inactivity would serve the same function. The specific regulatory pressure for sleep and the cognitive impairments that follow its disruption indicate that sleep is serving functions that cannot be replaced by mere rest. The conservation of core sleep regulatory machinery, the molecular clock components, the adenosine and serotonin signaling systems, the homeostatic regulatory principles across the enormous phylogenetic distance between insects and mammals suggests that sleep, in its fundamental form, is evolutionarily ancient. The last common ancestor of insects and mammals lived over 500 million years ago. The fact that both lineages retained homologous regulatory systems for behavioral rest over that time span implies strong selective pressure maintaining those systems, functions that are important enough that neither lineage could afford to abandon them. Back to the ceiling. Back to 2 in the morning and the motionless fly. The answer to the question that 2 in the morning brain asked is yes. That fly is almost certainly resting in a state that qualifies as sleep by the best behavioral criteria available. Its arousal threshold is elevated. It will take more stimulation to disturb it than would be needed during the day. Its nervous system is doing something during that rest that it cannot do during activity, something that the fly's biology tracks and compensates for when disrupted. Its circadian clock guided it to this moment of stillness as it guides the fly to activity at appropriate times of day in a system calibrated to the light-dark cycle of a rotating planet that the fly's ancestors have been tracking for hundreds of millions of years. Whether there is anything it is like to be that fly, resting on your ceiling, whether there is any inner experience of the rest, any dream equivalent state, any subjective sensation of the tiredness that preceded the rest, or the alertness that will follow it, that question remains genuinely open. The philosophy of mind hasn't solved consciousness for humans in any deep sense, let alone for insects, and the honest answer is that nobody knows. What the science has established is that the fly is not simply switched off. It is not equivalent to a parked car or a powered-down appliance. It is a biological system in a specific regulated state, performing functions that its waking state cannot perform, maintaining the neural integrity that tomorrow's foraging and mating and predator avoidance will require. It is, in whatever way is meaningful for a fly, resting. You, staring at it at 2 in the morning instead of doing the same, are not performing better on this particular metric. The fly, in some narrow technical sense, has its priorities more correctly ordered than you do right now, which is either a humbling thought or a sign that you should close whatever you're reading and go to sleep. The fly would probably agree. If flies could have opinions about such things, which, given everything the research suggests about insect cognition, you can no longer entirely rule out.